A grid is a type of datum element, a non-physical item that is used to establish project content. Similar to levels, which help manage vertical information, grids help organize the project horizontally. Grids consist of a series of lines along with bubbles, which contain the grid name. You can create grids in any two-dimensional view, such as a floor plan or elevation. To place a grid, on the Architecture ribbon, in the Datum panel, click Grid. As soon as you start the tool, the ribbon changes to the Modify Place Grid contextual ribbon. In the Draw panel, in the gallery, you can see the various sketch options available to create grids. For example, you can create grids as straight line segments or arcs. You can also use the Pick Lines tool to place grids based on existing geometry. The Multi-Segment tool lets you place a grid made up of more than one segment, such as a grid line with a small jog in it. For this example, click the Line tool. Before creating the grid, in the Properties palette, you can expand the type selector to choose the type of grid. Leave this set to the default. In the Level 1 floor plan view, click in the lower left of the drawing area to place the start point. Then, as you move the cursor, a temporary angle dimension appears showing the angle of the grid. You can press Shift to constrain the grid placement to vertical or horizontal. With the grid aligned vertical, click to specify the endpoint. When you do, the grid is created and Revit automatically numbers the grid. The default start number is 1. You can select or clear the checkbox at either end of the grid line to show or hide the grid bubble. The tool remains active, so you can place another grid. When the cursor is aligned with the end of an existing grid, Revit displays an alignment line so that you can match the start or end point. You also see a listening dimension indicating the offset distance. To create another grid, you can click to select its start point or type a distance. For example, type 30 feet or 9,000 millimeters in the metric file. Then, click to place the endpoint so that it is aligned with the end of the other grid. When you align the endpoints of grids, they are also constrained. You also see a temporary dimension showing the distance from the next closest grid. You can change this dimension to change the distance between the grids. For example, click the temporary dimension to make it active, and then enter 20 feet or 6,000 millimeters. You can continue creating grids manually or use the copy and array tools to quickly create large layouts. For example, press Escape or click Modify to end the command. Then select Grid Line 3. The ribbon changes to the Modify Grids contextual ribbon. In the Modify panel, click Copy, and then create several copies of that grid. Regardless of the method you use, Revit automatically numbers grids and increments the numbering based on the most recent setting. Click Modify to end the command. Switch back to the Architecture ribbon. Start the Grid command again, and make sure that you are using the Line option. Click in the lower left, and then move the cursor to the right to place a horizontal grid line. Revit initially assigns that grid the next number in sequence. To change this to a letter, click the grid number, type A, and press Enter. Then, create a second horizontal grid. The next grid is assigned the next letter in sequence. Revit is not actually differentiating between horizontal and vertical grids. It simply recognized that you switched to an alphabetical rather than a numerical sequence. So the next grid would receive the next letter in sequence, even if the next grid was a vertical grid. While you can always go back and change grid names later, to save time, the best practice is to create all grid lines in one direction first, and then create all of the grids in the other direction. Since the program will not allow you to create duplicate grid names, you should plan your numbering scheme and take care when adding grid lines late in a project. But again, you can always rename grids, and those names can include schemes such as Grid 1.5 or A.2. Be aware that Revit will not warn you if you place grids on top of one another.